The cards were set out before the first player arrived. That was how Maebell Frances Odom had done it for 11 years, and she was not going to change it at 74. She arrived at the Eastside Senior Community Center every Thursday at 4 in the afternoon, 2 hours before the bingo session began, and she set out the cards, not placed set. There was a difference she had learned in 31 years of work as a postal carrier, where the difference between placing a letter and setting a letter was the difference between a job done and a job done correctly. She set each card at the center of its space parallel to the table edge, equidistant from its neighbors. She set 70 cards because the session reliably drew between 60 and 75 players, and 70 cards meant no one arrived late to find nothing available. She then set out the chips, the red plastic discs that had been in a coffee can in the supply closet for 11 years, and that she cleaned and counted every Thursday as part of the setup and the daubers. 12 of them in the basket, refilled from the supply she ordered herself every 6 weeks with money from the bingo fund, which she had maintained for 11 years in a green 3-ring binder with color-coded tabs and a running balance on the first page. She was 74 years old. She had retired from the United States Postal Service at 62 after 31 years of service, 26 of them on the same route in the east side of the city, which was the stretch of residential streets between Harrison Avenue and the Riverside Community Park, that she had come to know, the way you come to know something you have given 31 years to, which is to say completely. She knew the progression of mailboxes on each block, and the specific hinges and latches of each one, and which ones were stiff in the rain, and which ones had been replaced since she started the route, and which families had been there from her first week, and which ones had moved 3 times in 30 years. She knew the names of the dogs, the ones that ran the fence, and the ones that stayed on the porch, and the one on Clement Street that had barked at her for 19 years, and that she had given a biscuit to every Thursday, which she had begun carrying in her bag in her 4th year specifically for that dog, and which she had continued until the dog died at 14, and she had stood at the fence on a Thursday and found the yard quiet and understood from the yard's quiet what that meant. She had grown up on the east side and had returned to it after raising 3 children in the house on Clement Street where she had lived since she was 26. Her husband Raymond had been a maintenance supervisor at the school district until his retirement 7 years ago, and was now a man who had found in retirement that he liked to garden more than he had expected, and who spent approximately 4 hours each morning in the backyard, and who came inside at noon with the specific contentment of someone who has completed a morning that has produced something visible and clean. They had been married for 48 years. Maebell had, on the occasion of their 40th anniversary, said to her daughter, "Your father and I have figured out the trick to a long marriage." Her daughter had said, "What is it?" She had said, "We both like being somewhere, and we have always liked being in the same somewhere." Her daughter had said, "That's it." She had said, "That's everything." She had started volunteering at the Eastside Senior Community Center 2 months after her retirement at the suggestion of her neighbor Louise, who had said, "Maebell, you need somewhere to be. You have been somewhere for 31 years, and you do not know how to be nowhere." Maebell had said, "I know exactly how to be nowhere, which is to not be nowhere." She had called the center the next morning. The center had been on Harrison Avenue for 27 years in a building that had been a hardware store before the hardware store moved, and that the neighborhood association had converted with a city grant and 3 years of volunteer labor into the specific thing that a senior community center is when it is done correctly. A place that is not a hospital and not a house and not a program and not a service, but a place where people who have been somewhere for a long time can be somewhere together. It had a main room and a kitchen and a smaller meeting room and the bingo hall, which was what everyone called the back room, even though it was used for other things on other days because bingo was what the room was associated with in the community's understanding, and you do not argue with what a room is associated with in a community's understanding. Maebell had walked into the center on a Tuesday morning in the second month after her retirement and had introduced herself to the program coordinator and had said, "I have 31 years of keeping a schedule and keeping track of things, and I have not stopped knowing how to do either. Where do you need me?" The coordinator had put her in Thursday bingo within 3 weeks because the woman who was running Thursday bingo at the time had just had a surgery that was going to require 4 weeks of recovery, and they needed someone who could learn the format quickly. Maebell had learned the format in one session sitting beside Earl at the callers table watching the way he ran it and asking 3 specific questions at the end. By the second week, she was running the first half of the session herself. She had been running Thursday bingo for 11 years. She had taken it over from a man named Earl who had run it for 7 years before his health declined to the point where setting the cards was more than he could do, and Earl had handed her the green binder and the coffee can and had said, "Don't change the format. The people know the format." She had said, "I won't change the format." She had kept the format, and she had also, over 11 years, improved the organization of the binder, added the color-coded tabs, modernized the supply ordering system so that they did not run out of daubers mid-session, and increased the weekly session attendance from an average of 42 players to an average of 71. She had done all of this without changing the format, because the format was right. The improvements were in the structure that held the format, not in the format itself. She understood the difference between what you changed and what you kept, which was the understanding that 31 years on the same postal route had given her. The route had not changed. The houses had changed. The residents had changed. The mail volume had changed. The route was the route. You learned what the route required, and you delivered what the route required, and you did not vary the method, because the method was the method for a reason, and the reason was that it worked. She had learned over 11 years of Thursday bingo what each of her players required. Not in a professional sense, in the sense of a 74-year-old woman who had spent her life paying close attention to people, and who had over 11 years accumulated the specific knowledge that comes from seeing the same people in the same setting once a week for over 500 sessions. She knew that Howard Gaines, 78, who had been coming since before she started volunteering, had a specific way of arranging his chips in vertical columns that he had done his entire life, and that he would lose his focus for half a session if the chips were not separated by color in the can. She had separated them by color since her 3rd week. She knew that Dolores Vega, 81, who had limited mobility in her left hand from a stroke 5 years ago, needed her cards within reach of her right hand without her needing to ask, and that she would not ask because Dolores did not ask for accommodations. She expected them to be provided by people who were paying attention. She had been providing them since the month after Dolores returned from the stroke rehabilitation. She knew that the Watkins sisters, Barbara, 76, and Carol, 79, arrived together and always sat at table 4, and that, if they arrived and table 4 was already full, they would stand at the edge of the room with a specific expression that was not quite distress, but was adjacent to it, and she had, for 11 years, ensured that table 4 had 2 open seats at 6 o'clock Thursday. She knew all of this because she had been paying attention for 11 years. She had been paying attention before anyone appointed her to pay attention, and she would have been paying attention if no one had ever noticed that she was, because paying attention was not something she did for recognition. It was the thing she was, and what she did expressed it. She had never in 11 years been thanked specifically for knowing how Howard arranged his chips, or that Dolores needed her cards within reach of her right hand, or that the Watkins sisters needed table 4. These things were not thanked because they were not visible as things, they were visible as results. Howard's focus was good. Dolores was comfortable. The Watkins sisters arrived and sat down immediately. The results were visible. The action that produced them was not which was exactly how it was supposed to be. You did the thing so that the person did not have to think about the thing. If they had to think about it, you had not done it well enough. She understood this because she had been a postal carrier for 31 years, and because the postal route had the same logic, the route existed so that the mail arrived. The carrier was the means, not the subject. The mail arrived or it did not. If it arrived correctly, the carrier was invisible, which was the correct outcome. She had been invisible on the postal route for 31 years, in the best way invisible, the way a thing is invisible, when it is working exactly as it should. The letters arrived. The houses knew when to expect them. The dog on Clement Street got his biscuit on Thursday. Everything was in order. Everything was always in order. That was the job. She understood the players, which was the thing that had built the session into what it was. In her first year, she had understood the game, and the format, and the supply ordering, and the financial record. In her third year, she had understood the players, what they were there for, which was not the bingo exactly, or not only the bingo, but the specific experience of being in a room where they were expected and known, and where the cards were set out before they arrived, and where someone understood without being told which table they preferred, and which color chips they used, and whether they needed their cards within reach of their right hand or their left. She had built that understanding one player at a time over 11 years, and it had built the session around itself the way good things build, not by design, but by the accumulation of small, correct decisions made over a long time. The session had become, in its 11th year, the most attended program at the Eastside Senior Community Center on any day of the week. The board had noted this in their annual report with the language of institutional acknowledgement, which is the language of, "We have noticed that this is happening." Maebell had not needed the annual report to notice it, because she had watched it happen one extra player at a time over 11 years. She knew when attendance was up because she had set out 73 cards instead of 70. She knew the shape of the growth because she had been present for every Thursday of it. The new program director arrived in September. His name was Derek Marsh. He was 33. He had been hired by the Eastside Community Center's board of directors to modernize the center's operations, which had been running in the board's assessment on volunteer enthusiasm rather than on institutional process. The board was not wrong that the center ran on volunteer enthusiasm. The board was wrong in their implicit assumption that institutional process and volunteer enthusiasm were opposed to each other. The center ran on both. The institutional process was the binder. The volunteer enthusiasm was why the binder had been maintained impeccably for 11 years. You did not separate them without losing something in both. He had a degree in nonprofit management and had spent the previous 3 years at a larger community organization in the northern part of the city, where he had implemented a financial oversight system that the board had read about in a regional nonprofit newsletter and found impressive. He had been given a mandate to bring the Eastside Senior Community Center's operations into alignment with current nonprofit governance standards. He arrived at the Thursday bingo session 2 weeks into his tenure at 5:45, which was 15 minutes before the session began. He observed Maebell setting out the last of the cards. He looked around the room. He looked at the supply closet where the coffee can of chips was stored. He looked at the binder on Maebell's table. He asked to see the financial records for the bingo fund. Maebell showed him the binder. She opened it to the first page and showed him the running balance. She showed him the color-coded tabs expenses on the left, income on the right, supply orders in the middle, and the session attendance log that she had maintained every week for 11 years. He looked at the binder for several minutes. He looked at the cash box, which was a metal box with a key that Maebell kept on her keychain alongside her house key and her car key, which she had been keeping that way since Earl had handed it to her 11 years ago. He said this cash should not be in a personal keyed box. It should be in the center's safe. Maebell said, "I have been keeping it that way for 11 years, and the balance has matched the ledger for 11 years. He said, "I understand. It's a governance issue. We'll need to change the procedure." She had said, "When you have a new procedure, show it to me and I will follow it." He had said he would get back to her. He had not in the following 6 weeks produced a new procedure. But something had changed. She had felt it in the way you feel a change in weather before the weather changes, not in what was visible, but in what the visible things indicated. The supply orders that she had been processing for 11 years through the center's petty cash system were now being routed through Marsh's office for approval, which added 10 days to the timeline and had twice produced a Thursday session where the dauber supply was low. She had mentioned this to Marsh. He had said the approval process was necessary. She had said, "I understand the approval process. The issue is the timeline." He had not responded. In the third week of October, a volunteer named Calvin Pruitt, who had been helping at bingo sessions for 8 months, reported to Marsh that he had concerns about the cash handling at the Thursday bingo sessions. Pruitt was 27. He had been assigned to assist with setup and breakdown, specifically the physical setup of the room before sessions and the cleanup and storage of supplies after them. He had access to the supply closet. He had access to the setup materials, which included the daubers and the chips and the cards. He had never been given access to the cash box, which Maebell locked and held and managed, and which did not require his access because it was not his function. He had access to the General Supply Fund, which was the separate petty cash account used for purchasing supplies and from which he had been authorized to make purchases by the center's administrative coordinator. He said to Marsh in a meeting that Marsh had not disclosed to Maebell and had not recorded in any formal way that he had observed Maebell place money in her coat pocket at the end of a session. He said the coat pocket specifically. He said the money specifically. He said he was not certain of the amount, but that he had seen her reach into the cash box and transfer something to her coat. He said he had not said anything at the time because he was not certain what he had seen. Marsh had listened to Pruitt's report. He had not taken notes on the report in a format that could be reviewed later. He had not asked Pruitt for corroborating detail, the date, the specific session, the position he had been standing in when he claimed to observe the transfer. He had not asked whether anyone else had been present. He had not looked at the 11 years of ledger records in the green binder which balanced to the cent for every session in that period and which had been available to him since his first Thursday at the center. He had not interviewed any of the regular players who had been present at hundreds of sessions and who had specific and detailed knowledge of what happened at the end of each session and what Maebell Odom looked like at the end of each session, which was the same as what she looked like at the beginning, exact and complete, and in control of every element in the room. He had not requested a financial audit, which would have taken 2 weeks, and which would have produced a clear result in a format that could be presented to the board and defended under scrutiny. He had decided that the report was credible, and that the credibility was sufficient to act on which was the specific error of someone who has been given authority and has confused the speed of action with the quality of action. He arrived at the following Thursday session at 6:15 minutes after it began. The room had 87 players. They were well into the first game. Maebell was at the caller's table with the cage and the balls and the bingo card key and the cash box locked on the table beside her, and the green binder open to the evening's page. Howard Gaines was at his usual table with his chips in vertical columns by color. Dolores Vega was at the table to her right, her cards within reach. The Watkins sisters were at table 4. The room had the specific hum of 87 people concentrating on their cards with the particular focused pleasure that bingo produces, the pleasure of people who have been coming to the same place for the same thing for years, and who know that the place and the thing are reliable. Marsh walked to the caller's table and said in a voice that did not account for the room, "Ms. Odom, I need to speak with you about a concern regarding the financial handling of the bingo fund." Maebell looked at him. She said, "We are in the middle of a session." She said it in the flat voice she used when she was stating a fact that required acknowledgement before anything further could proceed. He said, "This needs to be addressed immediately. There is an allegation that funds from the bingo proceeds have been misappropriated." The room had been concentrating on their cards. The room heard this. The room became quiet in the specific way that a room full of people who have just heard something they were not meant to hear. and that concerns someone they know becomes quiet. The quiet of people who are reassessing what they understood to be happening. Maebell said, "I have maintained the financial records for this program for 11 years. The ledger balances to the cent. You are welcome to inspect it, too." Marsh said the concern is that funds have been removed from the cash box before the ledger is closed. He said it with the careful precision of someone who is reading a statement rather than speaking from conviction, which is how people sound when they are repeating something someone else told them rather than saying something they know themselves. Maebell said there have been no funds removed from the cash box before the ledger is closed. "I am the only person who holds the key to this box, and I have held it for 11 years. She said, "I would like you to show me the basis for this allegation." He said, "I am not at liberty to disclose the source." He said, "I am going to need to take possession of the cash box until the matter is reviewed." He reached for the cash box. The room went silent. Not the quiet of people who had heard something they were not meant to hear. The different quiet of people who have heard something they were not meant to hear and have reached a conclusion about it and are now implementing that conclusion without discussion. The 87 people in the room who had been marking their cards and calling out their numbers and talking to their neighbors all put down their cards. No one said it was time to put down the cards. No one coordinated it. There was no signal and no consultation and no designated leader who gave permission for the decision. The decision was made by 87 people who had the same information at the same time and who had the same 11 years of the same knowledge and who arrived at the same conclusion at the same moment, the way a single organism arrives at a response when the right nerve is touched. The people in that room had been coming to Thursday bingo for an average of 6 years each. In that time, they had seen Maebell Odom set out 70 cards every Thursday before the first player arrived. They had seen her fill in the ledger at the end of every session. They had seen her lock the cash box with the key on her keychain and carry it to the supply closet and return it to the same shelf. They had seen her order the daubers 6 weeks before the supply ran low and fill the chips can and sort the chips by color and make sure table 4 had 2 open seats. They had seen all of this every week for an average of 6 years. And they had the specific knowledge of people who have seen a thing done correctly enough times to know with absolute certainty what correctly looks like. What Marsh had said did not correspond with what they knew. What they knew was 11 years of correct. They put down the cards. Howard Gaines spoke first. He was 78, and he had been coming to Thursday bingo for 15 years longer than Maebell had been running it, which made him the institutional memory of the room before she was. And he had a voice that had spent 40 years in a union hall representing workers in disputes about precisely this kind of thing. The accusation made without evidence, the authority claimed without basis, the person with less power being required to prove their innocence in public, while the person with more power did not have to prove anything at all. He had sat in conference rooms and on shop floors and in cafeterias and in parking lots, and had said the same essential thing in all of those places in the language appropriate to each. You do not do this to this person. He knew the language appropriate to this particular room. He said, "Put the cards down." Everyone had already put the cards down. He said it anyway because it needed to be said, because the putting down needed to be named so that the person who had caused the putting down could understand what had just happened. He said, "Derek, that box belongs to this program, and Maebell runs this program and has run it for 11 years, and the books are in that binder, and they balance, and you have seen the binder, and you know they balance because you looked at it 2 months ago." He said, "You do not touch that box without her permission. You do not accuse this woman in front of these people without evidence." He said it in the flat and direct tone of someone who has learned over 40 years that directness is not aggression. It is clarity. Aggression is what you use when you do not have evidence. Clarity is what you use when you do. Marsh said, "Mr. Gaines, this is an administrative matter and I am asking you to." Howard said, "This is a bingo session, and we are not playing until this woman is treated with the respect she has earned in 11 years of showing up every Thursday and making this room a place worth showing up to." Dolores Vega said from her table in the specific clipped voice of an 81-year-old who does not waste words and who had spent 60 years as a seamstress and then a union shop steward, and who had learned early that the most powerful thing you could say in a room was the exact true thing with no additions. "We are waiting." 2 words, the room held them. The Watkins sisters said nothing. They sat with their arms folded and their cards face down, and they looked at Marsh with the expression of 2 women who have seen a great many things in 76 and 79 years, and who know exactly what they are looking at. Barbara Watkins had been a school principal for 22 years. Carol Watkins had been a public health nurse for 30. Between them, they had seen most of what institutions could produce when they moved faster than their evidence, and they recognized what they were seeing now with the specific recognition of people who have been in those rooms professionally. They said nothing because nothing needed to be said. The room had said it. The cards were down. 87 people were waiting. That was a statement that required no addition. Maebell said, "I am going to give you the binder." She said it in the same flat voice, not resigned, not defensive, but the voice of someone who has been accused of something that the evidence will immediately disprove, and who is providing the evidence with the calm of complete certainty. She opened it and turned it to face Marsh. She said 11 years of records. Every session, every expense, every balance. You will find it matches the cash box to the cent, because it does match the cash box to the cent, because it has matched the cash box to the cent for 11 years. She said the opening balance on the first page is supported by the closing balance of the session before it. The closing balance of every session is supported by the ledger entry for that session. The ledger entry for every session is supported by the session count record in the attendance log. Every supply expense has a receipt in the corresponding tab. She said, "When you have reviewed it, I would like an apology." She said, "And I would like the name of the person who made this allegation, because they have said something that is not true about me, in the presence of 87 people who know me, and I intend to address it." She said all of this without raising her voice. She said it in the voice she had used for 31 years on the postal route when there was a situation that required precision. The voice of someone who knows exactly what they know and who is prepared to defend it completely. Not because they are threatened, but because they are right, and being right requires saying so clearly and in full. She was aware she spoke of 87 people in the room. She was aware of Howard Gaines at his table, who had just said the essential thing in the Union Hall voice, and who was now watching her with the focused attention of someone who is prepared to say the next essential thing if the next essential thing becomes necessary. She was aware of Dolores Vega, who had said 2 words, and who had the stillness of someone who has already done what she came to do and is now waiting for the situation to resolve in the direction she has decided it will resolve. She was aware of the Watkins sisters at table 4, whose combined professional history included 48 years of watching institutions fail and succeed in the specific ways that institutions do, and who were watching this with the specific attentiveness of people who know which kind of moment this is. She was aware of all of them, and the awareness was not pressure. It was support. It was the specific support of 87 people who had put down their cards and who were waiting, which is the most durable form of support. There is the kind that does not require you to be anything other than what you have always been, because what you have always been is what they came for. Marsh took the binder. He looked at it for 3 minutes. He turned several pages. He did not in 3 minutes find anything because there was nothing to find. He said, "I will need to have this reviewed by an accountant." Maebell said, "Then please do that." She said, "I will make the binder available at any time for the review." She said, "In the meantime, we have a session to complete and 87 people who are waiting." She put out her hand for the binder. Marsh returned it. She took it back and placed it on her table and opened it to the evening's page and picked up the cage and turned to the board. She said B7. Nobody moved for a moment. The room was still in the quiet of 87 people who had just watched a 74-year-old woman ask for her binder back and say, in the meantime, we have a session to complete, and who were deciding whether to believe her. They decided in under a second. They had 11 years of reasons to decide. Howard Gaines turned his card over and picked up his chips. Dolores Vega turned her card over. The Watkins sisters turned their cards over. One by one, 87 players turned their cards over and picked up their chips, and the room returned to its session because Maebell had said there was a session to complete, and because the session was there to be completed, and because Maebell Odom was at the caller's table with the cage and the binder, and she had just called B7, and no one in that room was going to leave B7 hanging. The accountant's review took 4 business days. The accountant was a woman named Patricia Huang, who had reviewed nonprofit financials for 22 years, and who had worked with organizations ranging from neighborhood block associations to regional foundations, which meant she had seen the full range of what financial record-keeping in the nonprofit sector looked like, from the impeccable to the catastrophic. The green binder was neither impeccable nor catastrophic in the way that those words usually apply to nonprofit financials. It was something rarer. It was complete. Not complete in the sense of containing all the required documents, though it did contain all the required documents. Complete in the sense of being a record that made sense all the way through, where the beginning explained the middle and the middle explained the end, and every number that appeared on one page could be traced to a corresponding entry on another page and verified by a receipt in the corresponding folder. She had reviewed financial records for 22 years, and she had learned that the test of a financial record was not its appearance, but its traceability. You could not trace the binder, not because the binder had gaps, but because there were no gaps to trace. Every line traced to something. Every something traced back to the line. She told the board at the conclusion of her review, "This is one of the most precisely maintained program financial records I have reviewed in 22 years of reviewing them. Every session balance is supported by the ledger. Every supply expenditure has a corresponding receipt organized by date in the tabbed section at the back. The running balance is accurate to the penny for 11 years of continuous operation. There is nothing missing." She said, "I want to be specific about what that means in practice." At no point in 11 years of weekly sessions did the cash box fail to match the ledger. Not once. In 11 years. She paused. She said, "I also want to note that the record is organized in a way that made my review significantly faster than it would have been otherwise. The person who maintained this record understood the purpose of financial documentation, which is not to satisfy a reviewer, but to tell the truth of the financial history in a form that another person can verify." She had found something else. In the course of her review, she had been given access to the center's general accounts, which included the general supply fund, the petty cash account, separate from the bingo fund used for purchasing general supplies for all programs from which Pruitt had been authorized to make purchases. She had not been asked to review the general supply fund. She had reviewed it anyway, because it was in scope, and because reviewing the surrounding accounts was part of understanding the whole financial picture of a program. The General Supply Fund showed a pattern of small discrepancies over the preceding 8 months' amounts that were small enough to fall below the threshold that would have triggered a flag in individual review. $12. Here, $23 there. A $40 purchase that had a receipt, but that the receipt was handwritten rather than printed, which was unusual for a supply vendor. Read as a series, the discrepancies over 8 months added up to $412 in purchases that had either no corresponding supply receipts or supply receipts that did not match the center's supplier records. The pattern of discrepancy began in the month that Calvin Pruitt joined as a volunteer. The last discrepancy was dated 3 weeks before the Thursday incident. Huang brought this to the board chair privately and then with the board chair's approval to the full board. The board brought it to the center's legal counsel. The legal counsel reviewed the purchasing records and interviewed Pruitt, who came in and initially provided a general denial of knowledge of the discrepancies. When presented with the specific dates and amounts and the receipts that did not match, He provided an explanation that accounted for 3 of the 15 discrepant items, and that could not account for the remaining 12. The matter was referred to law enforcement. Pruitt had resigned as a volunteer the week after the Thursday incident, which the legal counsel noted in the referral documentation, because the timing of the resignation was relevant to the question of whether the Thursday report had been motivated by something other than genuine concern about financial handling. Derek Marsh was asked to meet with the board 3 weeks after the Thursday incident. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. The board asked him to walk them through the decision to confront Maebell Odom in the presence of 87 bingo players without first completing a financial review or providing her with any notice of the allegation. He said he had believed the allegation required immediate action. The board asked what information had led him to believe that. He explained Pruitt's report. The board noted that Pruitt was the person who had also had unexplained supply discrepancies over the preceding 8 months. They asked whether Marsh had reviewed Pruitt's access records before accepting his report. He said he had not. They asked whether he had reviewed the 11 years of binder records before accepting the report. He said he had looked at the binder in the presence of Maebell on the first Thursday of his tenure. They asked whether he had seen anything in the binder that indicated a problem. He said he had not, but that the cash handling procedure was not consistent with current governance standards. The board said the cash handling procedure was consistent with the financial record, which is what an accountant tells us. They said you accused a volunteer of 11 years in front of 87 people without reviewing the evidence. He said he had not accused her. The board said, "What would you call it?" He did not have an answer that was accurate. His employment was terminated by mutual agreement 3 days after the meeting. The center issued a statement that did not use the word misconduct and that said the center thanked Marsh for his service and wished him well in future endeavors. The board sent a separate letter to Maebell Odom that said the review is complete. Your records are accurate and your conduct is above reproach. We are grateful for 11 years of service that this investigation has confirmed is beyond question. We apologize for the manner in which this matter was raised. We hope you will continue your work with us. Between the Thursday of the incident and the board letter there were 3 weeks. 3 Thursdays which the center had canceled because Maebell was on administrative leave pending the investigation's conclusion and there was no one available to run the session. The cancellations had been communicated to the regular attendees by automated phone message from the center's system, which delivered the information correctly and without context, and which therefore required the regular attendees to call each other to understand what had happened, which they did, because they were the kind of community that had each other's phone numbers for this purpose. Maebell had spent the 3 Thursdays at home. She had done the things she did on the Thursdays when she was not at the center, which was not nothing because she had a life that existed independently of the center, though the center was a significant part of it. She had cooked. She had called her daughter who had said, "Mama, this is going to be fine. They have the binder." She had said, "I know it's going to be fine. I know what the binder shows." She had called her son, who was an attorney, and who had offered to make calls, and who she had told, "Don't make any calls yet. Let the process run." He had said the process needs to run faster than this. She had said the process runs at the speed of an audit, and I cannot change the speed of an audit. He had said, "I know. I just wanted to make calls." She had not been idle during those 3 weeks in the sense that she had not been inactive. But she had been idle in the sense that she had not been able to do the thing she was built for, which was setting the cards out on Thursday afternoon and calling the first ball at 6 o'clock. That absence had a specific weight. She was aware of it on every Thursday of the 3 weeks. She was aware of it on the first Thursday when she would have arrived at the center at 4 o'clock, and she was home. She was aware of it on the second Thursday when Howard Gaines would have arrived at 5:35 and found the room set up and ready. She was aware of it on the third Thursday when Dolores Vega would have sat at her usual table with her cards within reach of her right hand without having to ask. She was also during those 3 weeks not uncertain. She had the binder. She had always had the binder. The binder told the truth of 11 years, and the truth of 11 years was not going to change because someone had made an allegation or because an accountant was reviewing it. The review would confirm the binder, or it would not, and if it did not, she would be wrong about herself in a way she could not imagine being wrong, which meant the review would confirm the binder. She sat with this knowledge the way she sat with most things that were true and that required waiting steadily without rushing the waiting. Raymond had brought her tea on all 3 Thursdays and had not said anything particularly useful because there was nothing particularly useful to say and had known not to try, which was the thing Maebell had been grateful for about 48 years of marriage. He knew when the situation called for tea and silence and when it called for something more. This situation called for tea and silence. He provided it. She read the board's letter on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table. She read it twice. She thought about what to say back, and she decided on 3 sentences which was the right number 1 that established the future 1, that established the continuity of the future with the past, and 1 that established what she expected from the institution. She wrote, "I intend to be at the center Thursday. The cards will be set before the first player arrives. I would ask that in the future, if someone has a concern about my work, they bring it to me before they bring it to a room of 87 people." She wrote it by hand on a note card and mailed it to the board president. She had been a postal carrier for 31 years. She still believed in the mail. The board president received the note card on Friday. He read it. He said to his wife that evening, "This woman is extraordinary." His wife said yes. He said she told us exactly what she needed from us in 3 sentences. His wife said that's because she's had 11 years of practice running something that requires precision. He said, "I know." He said, "We almost let that go." Derek Marsh's employment was terminated by mutual agreement 3 days after the board meeting. The board had not found a specific reason to terminate him for cause, because the finding was that he had been reckless rather than malicious, and reckless was a basis for performance improvement rather than immediate termination. But the mutual agreement was mutual because Marsh had understood in the 40 minutes of the board meeting that his tenure at the Eastside Senior Community Center was going to be short, regardless of the form it took, because the board's questions had made clear that they did not believe he had exercised adequate judgment, and the mutual agreement spared both parties the additional unpleasantness of the alternative. The center issued a statement that did not use the word misconduct, and that said the center thanked Marsh for his service and wished him well in future endeavors. 3 months later, the board adopted the financial record procedure from the Green Binder as the center's standard, creating a training document for program financial records that was based on the structure and organization that Maebell had developed over 11 years with her specific improvements to the original Earl format. The training document was used in the following year to train 2 new program financial volunteers. Both of them found the binder format intuitive. Both of them understood after reading the training document what the binder was actually for. The Thursday session after the investigation closed had 94 players. People had heard about what happened at the Thursday session 3 weeks before the Eastside neighborhood was not large enough for that story to stay in the room. And 7 people came who had not come before because what they had heard was that 87 senior citizens had put down their bingo cards and refused to play until a woman was treated correctly, and that seemed to them like the kind of Thursday to be part of. They had called the center to ask whether they could come. They had been told yes. They had been told there would be cards set out for them. Howard Gaines arrived at 5:45 and found Maebell setting out the last of the cards. He was wearing his good cardigan, which he wore to occasions that he believed required it. He said, "I brought you something." He had a coffee cake from the bakery on Maple Street. The bakery Maebell had been going to for 30 years. The same coffee cake with the walnut streusel that the bakery made on Fridays, and that could be ordered a day ahead for Saturday pickup, which Howard had done on Friday because he had planned this. He put it on the supply table. He said, "The coffee cake is from all of us." She said, "Howard, you didn't have to do that." He said, "I didn't have to do a lot of things this past month, and I did them anyway." She laughed. It was the specific laugh of someone who has been through something hard and has come out the other side and finds themselves able to laugh again, which is different from the laugh of someone who has not been through it. The way most things are different on the other side of a hard thing. She said, "Sit down, Howard. I'm almost done." He sat at his usual table and arranged his chips in vertical columns by color, which she had known he would do, and which was why the chips had been sorted before he arrived. He looked at his chips for a moment, and then he said, "Are you okay?" She said, "I was okay the whole time." He said, "I know. But are you okay?" She set the last card. She said, "I was worried for about a day that the binder might not be enough, that what I knew the binder contained might not be sufficient without the review." He said, "But it was." She said it was. He said, "Then you were right to trust it." She said, "I've been trusting that binder for 11 years. That's not the kind of trust that stops being trust because someone questions it." Dolores Vega arrived at 5:50 and sat at her table and arranged her cards within reach of her right hand, which Maebell had ensured before Dolores arrived. Dolores said nothing. She looked at Maebell. Maebell looked at her. They held the look for a moment, which was all that needed to be said between two people who had known each other for 11 years and who had been in the same room when the cards went down. The Watkins sisters arrived at 5:58 and sat at table 4, which had 2 open seats. She set the last card. She looked at the room 94 cards on tables in the specific layout she had developed in her 3rd year after 2 years of learning what layout produced the fewest collisions when people moved between tables and what produced the best sight lines from every seat to the board where the called numbers appeared. The daubers were in the basket. The chips were sorted by color in the can. The cash box was on her table with the key on her keychain alongside her house key, and her car key where it had been for 11 years. The board was set up with the number grid, the magnetic tiles ready. The cage was on the table with the balls inside. She looked at the binder, which was open to the evening's page. The date was written at the top in her specific block printing. Below the date was the opening balance transferred from the previous session's closing balance. Below the opening balance was a blank table waiting for the evening's entries. It would not be blank by the end of the session. It was never blank by the end of the session. That was the point of the page, not the blank space at the beginning, but the complete record at the end which told you everything that had happened and matched the cash in the box, and which would continue to tell you everything if you looked at it next week or next year or in 11 more years. She looked at the room one more time. Howard at his table with his chips in columns. Dolores with her cards within reach. The Watkins sisters at table 4. The 7 new people at the tables toward the back holding their cards with the specific tentative attention of people who are new to a place and who are learning its rhythms. She had placed them at tables with regular players because new people learned fastest when they were sitting next to someone who had been doing it for years. She said in the voice she had used every Thursday for 11 years, "Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Thursday Bingo." She paused, which was not her usual way. She usually went straight from the welcome into the first call. But tonight, she paused, and the room was quiet in the listening way, rather than the holding way, the way people are quiet when they are waiting for something they expect to be worth waiting for. She said, "For those of you who are joining us for the first time tonight, I want you to know that this session has been running every Thursday for 19 years. I have been running it for 11 of those years. I intend to run it for as many more as I can set out 70 cards and call a ball." She said, "You are welcome here. The format is simple and I will explain it as we go." She said, "Let's get started." The room answered the way it always answered, a warm and slightly overlapping consensus of good evenings and "let's go" and "I'm ready" in the voices of 94 people who were where they intended to be. The 7 new voices were in there, a little uncertain at the edges, learning the rhythm. She called the first ball. It was N42. The room marked their cards. Someone called out, "Wait, I think I heard wrong." She said N42, N as in November, 42. She said it with the patience of someone who has said it for 11 years and who will say it for as many more as there are new people who need to hear it again, which was fine. That was part of the job. The board in the weeks after Marsh's departure discussed what they had nearly allowed to happen. The chair said in a board meeting that they had hired someone to improve the center's governance, and that the center's governance had been governed in the area of financial record-keeping by a volunteer who had maintained a standard that exceeded most professional operations he was aware of, and that the board's failure to understand that had nearly cost them the person who maintained it. He said, "We need to understand what we have before we decide what it needs to change." The board agreed. They adopted the binder format as the standard. They also adopted a new policy for personnel matters involving volunteers, which required that any concern about a volunteer's conduct be brought to the volunteer directly and given an opportunity for response before any formal action was initiated. The policy was written in 3 paragraphs. It was adopted unanimously. Maebell received a call from Patricia Huang, the accountant, 2 weeks after the review closed. Huang said, "I wanted to tell you directly that your record is the best I have seen in 22 years of this work." Maebell said, "Thank you." She said, "Can I ask you something?" Huang said, "Of course." Maebell said if I had kept the record any less carefully, if the binder had been good but not precise, would the finding have been different? Huang was quiet for a moment. She said, "I don't know." She said the binder was precise enough that there was nothing to question. "I can't tell you what would have happened if it had been merely good." Maebell said, "I think about that." Huang said, "So do I." She said, "I think you have always kept it the way you kept it because that's how you keep things, not because you thought you would need it." Maebell said, "That's right." Huang said, "That's the thing that is hardest to document." She said, "You kept it for the work. The work just happened to need it." Maebell said, "Yes, that's exactly right." She drove home from the conversation the way she had driven home from the center for 11 years, past the bakery on Maple Street, where Howard had gotten the coffee cake, past the block where the hardware store had been before it became the center, past the 3-way stop where the crossing guard she had waved to for 20 years had stood before he retired. She turned on Clement Street and parked in her driveway and went inside and put her bag on the kitchen counter and called Raymond. He called back from the backyard in here. She said, "I'm home." He said, "I know." He came inside with dirt on his knees from the kneeling pad which he always had dirt on, and he said, "How are you?" She said, "I'm good." He said, "Good, good," or "Okay, good." She said, "I'm good, good." He said, "Do you want tea?" She said, "Yes." They sat in the kitchen. She told him about the call from Patricia Huang. He listened. He said, "She's right, you know. You kept it because that's how you keep things." She said, "Yes." He said, "That's you." She said, "I know." He said, "I know you know." He poured the tea. They sat at the table in the kitchen in the house on Clement Street, the house she had lived in for 48 years and intended to live in until she couldn't, and the evening came in through the window the way it always did at this time of year, and neither of them said anything for a moment because some moments did not require words, which was something else 48 years had taught them. The board implemented the new volunteer conduct policy the month after the Marsh matter closed. The policy required that any concern about a volunteer's conduct be brought to the volunteer directly and in writing before any formal action, and that the volunteer have 14 days to respond to the concern in writing before the board reviewed it. The policy was explicit about one thing: formal action taken in the presence of the persons the volunteer served. The clients, the members, the community was not an appropriate response to an allegation that had not yet been reviewed or confirmed. The policy did not use names. It did not need to. Everyone who worked at the center knew what it was about. The center's program director search, which began in November, produced a hire in January, a woman named Sandra Ellison, who had 20 years of experience in senior services and who had in her first week on the job asked Maebell to walk her through the binder format. She had spent 2 hours with the binder. She had said at the end, "This is extraordinary." Maebell had said it's the job done correctly. Sandra had said yes. But it is. She had asked Maebell if she would be willing to help develop the training materials. Maebell had said yes. She had said, "I'll need 2 hours on a non-Thursday." She would be at the center on Thursday. The cards would be set before the first player arrived. The chips would be sorted. The daubers would be in the basket. Table 4 would have 2 open seats. The binder would be open to the evening's page. The cage would be ready. The first ball was already waiting to be called. The things that hold a community together are often done by one person who does not believe they are holding anything. They believe they are setting out the cards. They believe they are opening the binder and filling in the date. They believe they are ordering the daubers 6 weeks before you run out and sorting the chips by color so Howard Gaines can think and making sure table 4 has 2 open seats at 6 o'clock. They do these things every week because the things deserve to be done correctly, and because the people who show up on Thursday to do them together deserve a room that is ready. That is what 11 years looks like. It does not look like a record or an achievement or a thing that requires defense. It looks like a table with the cards set parallel to the edge, equidistant from their neighbors, waiting for someone to sit down and play. It looks like chips sorted by color in a coffee can and daubers ordered 6 weeks before the supply runs out, and a binder with color-coded tabs maintained to the penny for every session of every year. It looks like someone who arrived at 4 o'clock before the first player arrived at 6 for 11 years because the room needed to be ready, and the room being ready was the job, and the job was worth doing correctly. That is what trust looks like when it is built on something real. You do not know you trust it until the moment you put down your card without being asked because you already know. She drove home from the center that Thursday night, the way she always drove home, past the bakery, past the hardware store turned community center, past the 3-way stop. She turned on Clement Street. She parked. She went inside. She put the binder on the shelf where it lived between sessions. She hung the cash box key on the hook by the door. She told Raymond about the new players. He said 7 new people. She said 7 new people. He said good. She said yes. Good. Subscribe our channel. We follow the people who set the cards before the first player arrives. Like this video if it moved you. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. Comment your thoughts or similar experiences.